So I've traveled to 53 countries over the past 4 years, and I've learned the hard way that most travel advice or stereotypes are completely wrong. I've heard it all. I've heard Colombia and Mexico are too dangerous. I've heard the food in Mexico and Bali is the best in the world. And I've also heard that the people in France are incredibly rude. Today I'm going to be revealing the 5 things I wish I knew before I started traveling. Let's jump into the first one. Mexico and Colombia. Are they really the most dangerous countries in the world like everybody makes you think? No, they are absolutely not. Now again, I've traveled to El Salvador in 2022 when it was still considered the world's most dangerous country in the world. And I also traveled to Mexico when it was going through a civil war. And on both of those trips in 2022 and 2023, my government was emailing me, telling me it is unsafe to go to these countries. And lots of Western countries like Canada and America frequently put out these international travel warnings about these countries in South America and Central America in particular. And my experience did not match the recommendations of my government or a lot of the warnings that a lot of my friends and family told me would happen to me in these South American countries. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not saying South America and Central America is way safer than the West. I don't believe that to be true. But what I do think is true is that the difference between violence in both regions is a lot more comparable than you might think. I mean, if you look at the statistics, it's very clear. American cities are far more dangerous than most American or Colombian cities. Of course, the exception here is Brazil. Brazil is incredibly dangerous. As you can see, when you're driving through the streets of Rio de Janeiro or Sao Paulo, which are the 2 biggest cities in Brazil, it looks dangerous, it feels dangerous, and even just my perception walking around as a gringo in those countries, you could feel people are watching you very differently. Again, people look at you funny in Peru or in El Salvador, but it's a very different look. And we're going to get to that in the third little misconception I want to cover for you guys in a moment. So again, Brazil's dangerous. Mexico and Colombia, do not listen to the warnings of most people. Obviously, it is true that there is a little bit of an epidemic when it comes to tourists being targeted in Medellin if they're trying to get on dating apps and things like that. But again, I've lived in Colombia for around 11 or 12 months, predominantly in Medellin. I never had any issues because I just wasn't doing anything that you just shouldn't be doing. Meeting a girl on a dating app that's covered in tattoos and getting into a taxi with her and her friends is probably not the best idea, okay? So if you are safe, if you do have a little bit of common sense about you, Colombia and Mexico is nowhere near as dangerous as you might think. Now, again, I do want to be clear. You do need to be careful if you're going to be driving through known cartel regions of Mexico at 3 a.m. on a Saturday night, okay? Obviously, don't do anything crazy. And the same warning applies to Colombia. It is very well known that there are organized gangs and syndicates in Medellin that target gringos on these dating apps. So obviously, use a little bit of common sense. Don't jump into an Uber with a girl who you matched with on Tinder that's covered in tattoos, okay? Again, there should be some common sense, and if you do use a little bit of basic common sense, you're probably going to be fine, which gets me into the next misconception, and that is the idea that Europe is safe. Now, I need to be careful with what I say specifically about the UK, but most of the statistics you see surrounding Europe are just absolutely not true. Again, I've had one trip on a train in the past 4 years. I've told myself for years, never get on a bus, never get on a train traveling. But I thought, hey, I'm in Europe, it can't be that bad. Everybody says it's so safe. And let's just say I had a horrific experience arriving to the Lisbon train terminal at like 8 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Let's just say it was infiltrated with the type of people you don't want to be surrounded by at 8 p.m. in an afternoon. It was, let's just say, horrifying. So what I will say is that Europe and the West overall is no longer safer than regions in South America. You can no longer say America, Canada, Australia, or Europe is safer than major cities in South America. It is not true. It is far more comparable. Now, this gets me into talking about the biggest misconception about France. A lot of people tell me that the people in France not only don't speak English, but they're incredibly rude to foreigners.
Bonjour.
Now, I was lucky enough to recently spend about 3 to 4 weeks in France. During my time there, I proposed to my then girlfriend, now fiance. Obviously, we got engaged in the city, but that does not color my opinion of France. France is genuinely full of very nice people. And I have to admit it, the locals in France are far more friendly than I would have thought. Now, are they friendly? Are they as welcoming as the people in Colombia or El Salvador? No, they're not. Let's be honest and real here. But are they as mean and as demeaning as many people across the world will have you believe? Is the stereotype correct that France people are just rude? I don't think so. I think they're far more similar to most people in Europe overall more broadly. I mean, I think the Spanish culture and the French culture is actually relatively similar, and I've kind of felt just as welcomed in both countries. And both countries, Spain and Europe, they were far more friendly than regions and countries like the Czech Republic. I also spent about 3 weeks in the Czech Republic on my most recent 2025 trip in Europe, where I spent around 80 days there. And from those 80 days there, I just thought it was abundantly clear. Like, there's far worse places in Europe when it comes to friendliness or welcoming, and I just did not feel welcomed in the Czech Republic at all. So I think that's another stereotype absolutely busted. Obviously, France is dealing with other issues that on the ground are probably even worse than is reported, but that's probably a story for another day. The next big misconception I want to tackle is this idea that the food in Mexico is the best in the world. So Mexico has a lot of Michelin star rated restaurants, but a lot of people will say that the food in places like Thailand and Mexico is not only the cheapest in the world, but it's also incredibly delicious. Now, I pretty much strongly disagree with this statement about Mexico in particular. Now, yes, if we're talking about, deep fried tacos that you can find on the street that you might get for $1, perspective is really important here. If somebody doesn't have a ton of money and they're trying to save money and they get 5 street tacos for $1 and the taste is not bad, obviously they're probably going to talk about the food in a different way if it had have costed like $10, for example. We can see here on Satlantis that to live in Mexico City costs somewhere around $2,500 per month, which is very comparable to what you see in some of the biggest cities in Peru or in Colombia. Again, yes, the food can be somewhat cheap based upon the circumstances in Mexico, but across the board, I do think it's a lot more comparable to some of these other South American countries that I think have a lot of advantages that Mexico doesn't have. We'll get into that in a moment. I think perspective is everything, and free food always tastes better than if you have to pay for it. So again, I challenge the idea that Mexico has the cheapest and the best food in the world, because if you go and buy some real food, like some high quality steak at a restaurant in Mexico City, it's cheap, yes. It's not expensive, but it's more fairly priced. And to be entirely frank, I think other countries like Brazil and Peru, and in particular Colombia, have better quality food at restaurants at the same price, if not cheaper. So again, I think that's another big common misconception that I think gets lost about Mexico. Now, I do have another misconception to talk about with Mexico, but before I get to that one, let's talk about El Salvador and Peru, because I think both countries kind of have a little bit of a bad reputation. When most people think of El Salvador, they still think of it as the world's most dangerous country. And when most people think about Peru, they think of maybe Machu Picchu and Cusco, but they don't think about the rest of the country. And I think both of them are hidden gems for people who might not know a lot of Spanish, but they're looking for somewhere to spend a few months and maybe meet some new people and make some new connections. I think most people think of Colombia when they think of meeting new people and making new connections. And I personally think the type of person who you're going to meet in El Salvador or in Peru is vastly different than the type of person you're probably going to meet in Colombia. And that's because I think both countries are actually very educated. And that stands true for Lima in particular. This is a massive capital city of Peru. Over 10 million people live in Lima, and it's incredibly different to a big city like Medellin in Colombia. In Lima, it's a city where people want to move to go and study university or start a business and learn English. They have some really well-renowned universities there for English speaking in particular. And let me tell you, there's a reason why I keep going back to Peru year after year after year, and that's because I think it has been one of the most underrated gems for tourists to go in particular. Not only because in Peru, they haven't seen a lot of tourists. So this obviously means that you're a little bit more foreign, you're a little bit more exotic, as much as I hate the word, and they're going to treat you very differently if you are new. I've felt nothing but incredibly welcomed by all the people in Lima, Peru. They treat you very differently than, for example, Europe might treat you if you're just another white guy, okay? So in Peru, they not only treat you very well, but they also have very high rates of English speaking, as you can see by this little table here. And I also found something very similar in El Salvador. El Salvador is another country that hasn't seen a lot of tourists, okay? It has been the world's most dangerous country for decades, meaning that the only tourists that went to El Salvador would have been the tourists who went for a little surfing competition on a coast in El Salvador for a very brief stay. I think the capital cities have never seen a lot of tourists going and setting up shop for a month or two and actually spending some time in the city. And I've seen the exact same thing in Peru, in Lima in particular. That city, it hasn't seen many tourists actually go and, you know, set up shop for a month or two. Now, this is slowly changing in both countries. Each time I come back to Peru, I can see slightly more gringos and slightly more, you know, people like myself who work online. They might have a business and they're spending a month in a certain location. I know this because I bump into people like this in the gyms, and I'm bumping into far more of these type of entrepreneurs and business owners than I was back in 2022 or 2024. The way I'm currently thinking about Peru right now, Lima in particular, is it kind of feels like how I think Colombia might have felt in 2016. So Medellin, Colombia, it was like a massive hotspot for tourists and gringos who were going there in the early 2010s and even 2016, 2017, 2018. At the time, the country was still kind of relatively unexplored. It was growing in its popularity. And when you're early in a country, again, it all goes down to supply and demand. If the local people haven't seen a lot of, you know, foreigners come to their country, they treat you very differently. They treat you very differently than you get treated right now in 2025 in Medellin, when the locals there are kind of sick of tourists coming to the country and exploiting the country for obvious reasons that we're not going to talk about in today's video. And this gets me into another misconception that's somewhat related to Colombia. A lot of people say that Colombia has one of the best digital nomad networks in the world. A lot of people say, go to Colombia and network. There's a ton of tourists in Medellin or in Colombia more broadly. And that is true, but what I think gets missed is what type of digital nomad you're interacting with. I would argue, again, I've lived in both countries and both cities for an extended period of time. I would argue the type of digital nomad who you're going to meet in Lisbon, Portugal, they are vastly different to the type of digital nomad you would meet in Colombia. Again, I don't want to put numbers on things because I'm really just speculating right now, but it feels like 70 to 80% of the tourists who go to Medellin, they don't go there because they're building a business. They go there because let's just say, they're taking advantage of some of the more unsavory things that the city is known for. And this is vastly different to Lisbon or Portugal, because if I had to do a little bit of a flip of the script here, I would have to guess that something like 80% of the people going to Portugal are going there to take advantage of the business connections. They might be going there to try to get a golden visa. They might be going there to try to buy property. Again, I think it's completely different, and I do see a similar dynamic with Peru. If you go to Cusco, 80% of the tourists that you might see in Cusco, they're more of your travelers and explorers, and there's a lot of tourists and nomads in that city, but what I think gets lost is looking at the different type of nomad or the traveler you're interacting with. I think a lot of time people just think, okay, a nomad's a nomad, a traveler is a traveler. And again, I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. So if you are traveling or if you are looking for somewhere to spend an extended period of time, I would just encourage you to think about, okay, this country, it is true that Mexico and Colombia, they do see a lot of tourists, but what type of tourists are you interacting with? The same applies to Costa Rica. Millions of people travel to Costa Rica each year, but how many hardcore business owners are going to Costa Rica? It's just a question. I've only really spent 2 weeks there, so I can't have a very strong opinion on that topic. But what I will say is it's more like 70 to 80% of the people who go to Costa Rica just want to chill out, they want to jump on a surfboard, and they just want to lay in the sun for 18 hours a day. Obviously, there's exceptions to every rule, but this was just something I noticed in Costa Rica. Each country, it's very different, the type of people who is going to travel there. So if you are looking for somewhere to set up shop and spend a lot of time in, this is something I'd encourage you guys to think a little bit more deeply about. Not every traveler is created the same, okay? Everybody's very different. Everybody's going to different countries for different reasons. If you want to go somewhere where you want to build connections, or if you want to establish friendships more easily, go somewhere where the supply and demand imbalance works best in your favor. Again, there's tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of gringos and business owners who go to Medellin each year. If you want to stand out a little bit more, and if you want less competition, so to say, why not go to a city like Lima in Peru? I might break down the differences between Lima and Medellin in a little bit more detail in another video, but I think that's a fair consideration I'd encourage you guys to think about. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, I had another misconception about Mexico I wanted to talk about, and that was talking about the violence and the safety situation in Mexico in a little bit more detail. I actually broke this down in depth in another video on this channel. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link to that video somewhere around there. And with all that said, thank you so much for tuning in. Let us know in the comments down below what you thought was one of the biggest misconceptions. I'll see you all in the next one.